Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Bridging the Gap Between Theory and Practice webinar series, proudly presented by World Heritage USA with the support of the Historic Preservation Education Foundation. This series is designed to support emerging professionals in the field of heritage preservation by providing specialized training that helps bridge the disconnect between academic study and real-world application. Whether you're just beginning in your career or if you're an established professional looking to revisit foundational concepts in a new way, this series offers insights and resources to deepen your knowledge and practice. In today's episode, we're diving into one of the most impactful processes in U.S. preservation work, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. For many emerging professionals, the term Section 106 is one you might recognize from a classroom setting or a textbook, or even as you're looking through new job postings. But fully understanding its implications, procedures, and the roles different stakeholders play in the process is something that typically comes with direct hands-on experience. So the goal of today's webinar is to unpack this complex but crucial component of the federal preservation system and help you feel more prepared to engage with it in your work. Now, to help us navigate this important topic, we've been joined today by two experts who are deeply familiar with Section 106 review and compliance, and they'll walk us through the goals of the process, how it's triggered, what types of federal actions fall under its purview, and how consultation and public involvement come into play. We'll also explore some case studies that illustrate the process in action, highlighting how Section 106 can both protect cultural resources and offer opportunities for collaboration among federal agencies, tribes, state historic preservation offices, and community members. We encourage you to actively participate in today's discussion. Use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions you have for our speakers throughout the webinar, and we'll address as many as we can at the end of this live session. In the future, we'll also be sharing additional resources on our Bridging the Gap webpage, including reading materials, guidance documents, and additional tools that you can use to further your understanding of Section 106. So whether you've encountered the process before or are learning about it here for the first time, we hope this episode provides clarity, sparks new questions, and equips you to engage more confidently in preservation projects involving federal undertakings. So thank you for joining us today. And now let's get started. Our first speaker today is going to be Blythe Semmer, a planner and historian currently working as the Assistant Director for Special Initiatives at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. In this role, Blythe focuses on improving federal preservation and interagency coordination through policy and guidance development and by educating Section 106 review participants about the requirements of the process. She previously coordinated the ACHP's Section 106 training program and has assisted a range of federal agencies with National Historic Preservation Act compliance. Prior to joining the ACHP, Blythe worked in a state historic preservation office for Nashville's Metropolitan Historical Commission. She holds a PhD in urban and regional planning and design from the University of Maryland. And so, Blythe, thank you for joining us today. I'll take this moment to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katelynn, and hi, everybody. It's great to be with you today to talk a little bit about Section 106. Let me get some screen shares started here. But yes, glad to be here and glad to get a chance to sort of look a little bit at what Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation is, and how preservation folks work with this process and get involved sometimes in consultation. So as we start with a discussion on Section 106, it's good to remember, where did that come from? Section 106 is so named for the section in the National Historic Preservation Act where the review requirement originally appeared. And so NHPA, the National Historic Preservation Act, was passed in 1966, just a few years before NEPA, in response to the loss of historic properties due to large federal highway and urban renewal projects, a lot in major cities happening at that time. And while there were other preservation laws that predated the NHPA, this was a major step in creating federal policy and an overall preservation program in the federal government. So the NHPA created and did a lot of things, one of which was establishing the NHP. Just for background, we're an independent federal agency with a presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed chairman as our agency head. There are 24 council members who either represent designated federal agencies or are appointed by the president. We also have nonprofits and associations representing state and tribal interests on the board that comes together to kind of do the policy work of the ACHP. The agency we're part of the executive branch of the federal government alongside other federal departments like the Department of Interior or Agriculture. With respect to Section 106, the ACHP issues the Section 106 regulations, provides technical assistance and training to federal agencies and all other participants in the review process. We resolve certain disputes in Section 106 and may participate actively in consultation to resolve adverse effects in certain cases. So here's what the National Historic Preservation Act itself says that federal agencies have to do. And you have on your screen a view of the text that comes out of the statute. So Section 106 is a procedural requirement. This language requires the head of a federal agency to take into account on historic properties the effects of an undertaking that it proposes to carry out, license, permit, or assist, and also provide the ACHP a reasonable opportunity to comment prior to making a final decision. So this results through the Section 106 regulations, which sort of provide the how-to instructions to federal agencies in terms of how to meet this requirement. It results in a four-step review process that requires consultation with certain parties and also offers opportunities for public review and comment. And so this resource that we have the URL on your screen, the Citizen's Guide to Section 106 Review, sort of describes it overall in very plain language and talks about how, any sort of member of the community or the public might interact with or get involved with Section 106. So just taking a broad view of the review process, let's look at a few things generally that the review does and doesn't do. So Section 106 recognizes that historic preservation values are public values, and it provides a forum for balancing these values with the others that may come into play in project planning as federal agencies are trying to carry out their missions and address a wide range of community and national needs. So ultimately, it offers a planning process where that historic preservation and historic property concern can come in and be factored alongside a whole range of other considerations to make a process, hopefully make a project more effective. So Section 106 includes an active exchange between the agency and the community as represented by consulting parties and provides them access to the federal decision-making process. But at the end of the day, the federal agency is the one who has responsibility for all the decisions made in 106 and for demonstrating how it complied with that language that came out of the law. A few things the review process doesn't do. There's not a guarantee that historic properties will be preserved if something goes through Section 106 review or that a project will stop. It also doesn't require a specific type of mitigation. There's not a formula written into the regulations that dictates that if a federal agency finds a certain kind of historic property, that it has to treat it in a certain way. Those decisions rather are worked out through consultation. So this process works best when it's started early, when there's a broad range of alternatives that may be considered. Also know that you don't have to be an expert to take part. There will be professionals like State Historic Preservation Office staff who play key roles in Section 106 review, but it is not an exclusive conversation between them and the federal agency. So again, it's kind of a law that asks the federal government to stop, look, and listen. The Section 106 review can, allow time to explore effects on historic properties and pursue alternatives. In terms of when, how do you know if a Section 106 review will be required? How do you know that one is going to take place in the first place? So there's two circumstances that must be met for a 106 review to occur. First, is there federal involvement? And second, is the project the type of activity that might affect historic properties, if any happened to be present? So when something is occurring on federal land, like in a national park or a national forest, or it's happening at an Army installation or in or on a federal building, Section 106 probably applies. Those are fairly easy to discern because there is a federal land or building manager who's either carrying that project out or giving permission for it to happen. Um, However, projects carried out by private individuals, by local or state agencies, and businesses may also have that federal involvement if they're using federal grants or if they require a federal license or a permit, like a license from the Federal Communications Commission, a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, wetlands. Those are some examples. What are we looking for then in Section 106? And just to be clear, when we talk about historic properties in this context, there is a specific definition. That's properties that are included in or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So many of you are likely familiar with the National Register, which is a program administered by the National Park Service. Properties don't have to be formally listed in the National Register, however, to be considered in Section 106 review. The regulations include provisions that allow a federal agency and the state or tribal historic preservation officer to come to consensus about whether that property meets the eligibility criteria. And if they do, then it moves forward and receives the same kind of consideration in Section 106 as a property that has. When we talk about the participants of Section 106 and those interactions between the federal agency and other participants, we recall that Section 106 is a public process, and federal agencies must consult with others in the course of making the decisions that they do about how their projects will affect historic places. We use the term consulting parties, and the regulations use that term as well to talk about the Section 106 participants. So as we look at this graphic and kind of go clockwise from the federal agency, you will see the state or tribal historic preservation officer, federally recognized Indian tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, local governments, and applicants for federal permits, licenses, grants, or other approvals. All of those have the right to participate in Section 106 consultation. And then continuing around, you see that additional consulting parties may ask the agency to participate or be invited by the agency to join. And that can encompass interests such as a legal or economic relationship to the undertaking, like a property owner might have, or a party's interest in the historic preservation effects of the project. So that might mean that a local preservation organization joins in consultation that way. The National Park Service and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation also participate in certain cases. So all of the consulting parties take an active role in working with the federal agency while a review is underway. They provide information, they react to proposed findings and determinations, they may suggest alternatives that can reduce the effects of the project on historic properties. So these are the parties who sort of have a seat at the table for that dialogue. Note that the public here is in the room, but isn't really sitting at the table. So while a member of the public can always provide their views to the federal agency official, that role is not as actively engaged as a consulting party. But you know that Section 106 includes requirements so that the public has opportunities to provide input. So this chart sort of gives us a quick tour of the process and what the agency is doing at each step. So at the beginning of Section 106 review, the federal agency is really sort of getting organized, figuring out first, is a Section 106 review required for this project? Who needs to be involved? You know, how will we coordinate this with other reviews and other obligations that the agency has in its overall planning process? In step 2, then, a lot of the boots on the ground work that happens in Section 106 review gets started. This is where the agency is trying to identify historic properties first by figuring out where it needs to look, where to look for historic properties, and we call that the area of potential effects, where the undertaking, where that project could cause changes to historic properties if any were present. So the agency kind of defines that area and then carries out appropriate identification efforts. And that can range according to the circumstances of any individual project. It might be something like a records review. It could be new survey field work. It could be talking to people, gathering ethnographic information. There's a wide range of different approaches that might be appropriate given the particular circumstances. The agency is trying to discover, is there anything out there that meets the National Register criteria? Do we have a historic property present? If so, the agency would move into step 3, where the focus is on determining if any of those historic properties located in the preceding step could be adversely affected. And that adverse effect term means the characteristics that qualify those places for the National Register could be changed in a way that diminishes their integrity. So sort of lessening the integrity of those historic properties. If so, again, if there could be an adverse effect, the agency moves into that final step of the process about resolving adverse effects. And again, in consultation, is shifting its focus to consider alternatives and measures to avoid, minimize, or mitigate those adverse effects. So as the agency discusses those potential measures with consulting parties and comes to consensus or agreement on what might be an appropriate course of action there, any commitments the agency makes are put into a memorandum of agreement, or sometimes called a programmatic agreement, that formalizes the agency's commitment to follow through on those things as it implements the project. Note here that consultation is occurring all along the way, and also that there are exit points at any steps of the process. And so I think it's good to know that a very small percentage of all the Section 106 reviews happening across the country each year actually make it to step 4. Most exit the process because there's no historic properties present, or if there are, they don't experience adverse effects. So it's a very small number that actually get to that step 4 process of developing a memorandum of agreement and resolving adverse effects. I think this is also a good point to sort of pause and consider some of the wide variety of jobs and areas of expertise that contribute to these various tasks that are happening in the 106 process. I mean, you can have historians, architectural historians, archaeologists, who might be on the staff of a state historic preservation office. They might work for a consulting firm that's helping the federal agency or the applicant. There could be somebody like a cultural anthropologist who's doing, ethnography. A city planner might sit at the table in consultation for a local government. You might have a historic architect who develops plans for an applicant that's working on a rehab project. An attorney could be involved for various parties. Somebody with policy or nonprofit management experience might be there to represent like a nonprofit preservation organization. And those roles could shift, and those disciplines could be represented all across the board. All of those, as well as experts with Indigenous knowledge, are represented in the work that happens in a Section 106 review. So in order to look at a couple of examples of like, what does this look like in practice, I wanted to share 2 quick case examples. The first is an example of a successful Section 106 review that took into account the potential effects to a very important historic property, in fact, a World Heritage Site. This was in Taos, New Mexico, and involved a regional airport project. So for more than 1,000 years, the people of Taos Pueblo have inhabited the Taos Valley and mountains, and there are numerous ancestral home sites and cultural areas remaining in use. It's located just north of the town of Taos, and the Pueblo has maintained and sustained its traditional culture, including the internationally recognized multi-story adobe dwellings and sites at the center of the community. The Pueblo is a National Historic Landmark and the only U.S. World Heritage Site recognized for its ongoing way of life and its traditional culture. So the town of Taos here proposed a new longer crosswind runway at its regional airport with the goal of trying to increase safety for aviation in challenging mountain terrain. So the runway construction required the town's airport authority to get approval from The Federal Aviation Administration, which so FAA, and carrying out this project was responsible for the Section 106 process. The ACHP got involved in the review when the FAA and consulting parties at first disagreed about aspects of the effort to identify historic properties, given that there were potential audible and visual effects, of new flight patterns that could disrupt traditional cultural activities. So those circumstances were unusual for runway projects and required different analyses than those typically relied upon in environmental reviews. But input from Taos Pueblo members who possess unique expertise in defining the cultural characteristics and how they could be affected by overflights broadened FAA's understanding of the adverse effects and helped lead to consideration of innovative approaches to addressing them. So that included developing measures to limit overflights of the Pueblo and its environs, and also educational efforts directed at pilots. FAA concluded the unique status of the Pueblo as a World Heritage Site merited measures that were outside the usual realm of what's discussed for mitigation and incorporated those finally into an MOA that was signed in 2011, a memorandum of agreement to conclude the Section 106 process. So that MOA represents an unprecedented effort by FAA to voluntarily restrict overflights because of the effects to a historic property of exceptional international significance. And while that project is not necessarily one that would be typical of your everyday Section 106 review, there's a whole range of others, of course, happening all across the country. And many, as I said, result in no adverse effect to historic properties like this one at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, which was established in 1941 as an engineer replacement training post. And in the segregated Army of the time, African-American troops had separate housing and recreational facilities. This building, 2101, was reassigned as a Black Officers Club in 1942. In 1945, Staff Sergeant Samuel A. County, an African-American soldier who was stationed there, painted a mural for the club. County was a successful artist and art instructor, and the mural here at Fort Leonard Wood is believed to be the only surviving piece from his military art career. From 1943 to 46, this installation also housed German and Italian prisoners of war who built stonework masonry features that still exist at the building and its grounds. The building was determined eligible for the National Register in 1998. In the post-war period, though, Fort Leonard Wood was adapting to changing Army needs. And in 2011, the building was scheduled to be used as an office and classroom space, but the unit that was supposed to go there decided in the end they didn't need the building, and it thus sat vacant for several years. The Army was seriously considering removing the mural and demolishing the building when it entered into Section 106 consultation with the Missouri SHPO, the ACHP, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and other interested parties, including Samuel County's niece. The consulting parties opposed demolition of one of the last remaining World War II era Black Officers Clubs, but the primary issue was finding a new tenant. So ultimately, the Army converted the building into classroom as well as meeting and social space, conserved the mural, and made needed repairs to that POW stonework. And it concluded the rehabilitation would result in no adverse effect to Building 2101. So a part of this success was how the consulting parties really strongly advocated for the Army to reconsider its demolition plans and find a compatible long-term use. So rehab was completed in early 2019, and that project illustrates how historic properties like this building can be productive assets for an installation's mission, as well as a venue to tell a story that's broader. And so its preservation allows opportunities to tell the story of African-American Army officers during World War II. So you can learn more about both of those Section 106 cases on our website, and you have the URL there. Also encourage you to visit achp.gov for a lot more information about Section 106, information on a variety of training opportunities, including e-learning, and other informational resources and links about Section 106 that go into a whole variety of topics. But thank you for letting me join you today.
Thank you so much, Blythe. We really appreciate it. I think to many, Section 106 can seem incredibly complex, but you did a great job breaking down the process and illustrating how it plays out in real world scenarios that made it seem a lot more simple. I'm looking forward to revisiting some of your points during the Q&A, but first I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Krista Horrocks. Krista currently works as the Department Manager of Education and Support Services for Ohio's State Historic Preservation Office at the Ohio History Connection. And so, Blythe, whereas you provided the federal perspective, we've brought Kristen here today to join us and provide a more local perspective, what happens in individual states or individual communities. And so in her role at the State Historic Preservation Office in Ohio, Kristen manages a team of administrators, grant managers, GIS coordinators, and database managers in the support of all program areas for the SHPO. And she also serves as Ohio History Connection's cemetery preservationist, where she works to provide research support, guidance, and presentations on all things Ohio cemetery related. Krista previously spent 8 years as an archaeological project review manager for Section 106 review team and 10 years in cultural resource management as a principal investigator and project manager. She holds a Bachelor of Specialized Studies in Historic Anthropology from Ohio University and a Master of Arts in American Studies with a focus on public history from Youngstown State University. Fun fact, she is a sixth generation Ohioan. So Krista, thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to present for you guys today. So thank you guys again for having me today. Like Katelynn mentioned, my name is Krista Horrocks. I'm a Department Manager of Education and Support Services here at the SHPO, but I am a cemetery preservationist, so I do a lot with the public when it comes to cemeteries, give lots of trainings around cemetery documentation and preservation. So this is kind of very adjacent to that. So I appreciate you having me. So I'm going to talk today about the Brown Harris Cemetery, which was a lost African-American cemetery that was discovered in 2020 as part of a Section 106 project that was in Dublin, Ohio. And Dublin is a suburb of Columbus here in Central Ohio. And like mentioned, I did serve as the archaeological reviewer for this project. Okay, so the proposed project that triggered the Section 106 process was known as University Boulevard. It was a roadway realignment project, as well as the construction of this medical facility that you see here that was for The Ohio State University. The Army Corps of Engineers, Huntington District, served as the lead federal agency for the project. Originally proposed in 2017, the project went through various renditions. The first archaeological investigations to take place in the area was in a large, now fallow agricultural field. A small number of prehistoric sites and isolated finds were discovered during these investigations, but nothing significant or considered potentially eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. However, there was a documented archaeological site directly adjacent to the project area. It was recorded in 2004 by an amateur archaeologist whose name is Bill Likens. And the site was documented as 33 FR 2385, also known as the Likens Site 2. And you can kind of see it up there, kind of in the central north part of this map as a green triangle with a green polygon around it. So that was the boundaries and the documented site that we had when this project started. So Mr. Likens recorded the following information on the archaeological site form. Quote, was told by owner's wife of a black graveyard on the back corner of property that her husband's grandfather had made them move. But I found one headstone of a 12-year-old boy buried in 1854. So when this project started, this was really the only information we had about a potential cemetery located on the property. You can see here, I'll go back real quick, that if the cemetery was located where it was documented originally on the site form, then it looks like the cemetery probably isn't there anymore because there was this larger industrial development that had gone in since. But we weren't confident that we had good locational information, so we wanted to keep pursuing this. Through the course of the project, the cultural resource firm that was hired on to work on the project was able to get in touch with Mr. Likens, and he recorded additional information about his discovery from memory. So he provided this map showing where he found the gravestone, which is location A, in relation to the Rings farmstead that used to be on the property. So the Rings family were the owners of the property when he recorded this archaeological site. It was the Rings family that allowed him to hunt for artifacts on their land. And when he found the gravestone, he brought it to them and they placed it in their barn. Unfortunately, the Rings family sold their land to the city of Dublin around 2005, and the house and the barn were burned down for firefighter training at that time. So it is presumed that the gravestone that Mr. Likens found was likely hauled away with the debris from the firefighter training on the property, because future investigations were never able to re-identify that gravestone that he found. Which is all the more reason why us as cemetery preservationists tell people never to move a gravestone out of a cemetery. That's for these reasons. One of many reasons. So by 2019, the University Boulevard project plans were set, and the project area and the area of potential effect were finalized. So additional archaeological investigations took place in the areas not previously surveyed in 2017. But the question still remained, what about the Likens site 2 and the supposed African-American cemetery that used to be on the property? I knew from my experience as a cemetery preservationist, if someone claims a historic cemetery has been moved, it probably hasn't. It is much more likely that the gravestones were moved or destroyed and the cemetery plowed under. So to help answer the question, we turn to historic research. So historic atlases helped us better understand other records, like the census records we were reading at the time. This map shows the various African-American families that were confirmed through census records, like the Brown, Smith, and Harris families. The name that initially stuck out to me was Depp. And you can see that there, as well as the Smith and Harris families highlighted in red. Depp is a well-known African-American surname in the greater Central Ohio area. And the Depp family is memorialized just one county north in Delaware County through the Lucy Depp Park. So 14 years later, we have another atlas dated from 1856 that shows more and different African-American families in the area, including the Chisels or Chisels. The cultural resource management firm georeferenced the 1856 atlas onto a modern day aerial map. And spoiler alert, you can see the Brown Harris Cemetery in the northwest corner of the J. Brown property on this map. By 1872, the Harris and Brown families were the only two left in the area. The Rings family now owns property to the west of these two families, and it is the Rings that will purchase the final parcel that was owned by Mary Brown. And you can see the last atlas from 1910 that shows the Mary Brown property as it existed then. So when Mary Brown passed away in 1915, her daughter, Sarah Ann, sells the land to John Rings, and that ends the last African-American owner in this area. Just a fun fact, while we can't confirm the exact age of Mary at the time of her death in 1915, we do believe she was well over 100 years old by the time she passed away. A 1938 aerial photograph shows no evidence of the cemetery on the property previously owned by Mary Brown. You can see the red arrow here that indicates the location of the cemetery as we know it today. We assume shortly after the Rings family purchased the property, the cemetery was plowed under, and any gravestones like the one Mr. Likens finds in the early 2000s were moved. So what do we know about the Brown, Harris, and other African-American families who lived in this small pocket of rural lands close to the Franklin and Delaware County borders? So really the answer is not a whole lot. We can trace them through census records, but even that information is hard to pin down because of the variation in ages and birthplaces. What we did learn is that Mary Brown and Jeremiah Harris who were the matriarch and patriarch of these two families, were both born in Virginia. So knowing the Brown and Harris families came from Virginia, we began researching records from the Library of Virginia. And with their help, we discovered the emancipation records for the Brown and the Harris families, which detailed the names of the emancipated slaves, which matched up to our genealogical information on the Brown and the Harris families. This information, while it hasn't been thoroughly transcribed yet, is very fascinating information. It also details a many-page, I believe 40 pages, if I'm remembering off the top of my head, of a court case that kind of focuses around these emancipated slaves. So their owner had passed away and emancipated them, giving them money to move to Ohio and buy lands here. But there was a large court case around it where it appears that likely members of her family, she had no children, fought the emancipation and attempted to keep the slaves for themselves. But after a number of years of fighting, they were emancipated and moved, had the ability to move to Ohio. So another lead that we had was from the Dublin Historical Society, who possessed this picture. And this picture is supposedly of George Washington and family. So George is a well-known African-American in the Dublin area, as his gravesite is a stop for local school children on history tours. This is a picture of his gravestone, which reads, "Born in Slavery." George appears in census records living with the Brown family as first a boarder and then as a companion. He was never married, nor did he have any children. We believe this image might be of George Washington, Mary Brown, and Mary's two daughters, Sarah and Caroline, taken during the time when George was living as a companion with the widow Brown. So all of this historic research helped us confirm one thing, that there is or was likely a cemetery on the property. And I believed at the time there still was. As traditional phase 1 archaeological investigations were not able to identify the cemetery, ground penetrating radar took place to identify any soil anomalies that might lead us to the cemetery. The results of the GPR survey identified 7 possible anomalies for us to ground truth. Also, incredibly, during the geophysical survey, a fragment of marble footstone was found on the ground surface while they were running their equipment over the area for GPR survey. So this footstone is engraved with an H, and we really considered this our smoking gun. So without the Lycan's gravestone, we couldn't prove physical evidence of the cemetery on the ground surface until this footstone fragment was identified. But after this was found, then there was little doubt to us that there was indeed a cemetery out there somewhere. We just had to find it. So subsurface investigations took place in 4 areas around the anomalies identified during ground penetrating radar survey. Trench 4 was actually didn't have any anomalies, but it was a buffer set around the footstone location. A traco removed the plow zone, which was approximately 18 inches deep of soil, to expose the subsoil beneath. Excavations in trenches 1, 2, and 3 did not identify any cultural features, but trench area 4, where the footstone was located, was a success. So on April 1st, 2020, the first grave shafts were exposed. Only the plow zone was removed and no human remains were excavated during these investigations. Outlines of the burial shaft were obvious due to the rectangular size and the color and texture of the soil. As the traco moved along the line, more and more grave shafts were discovered. In total, 22 grave shafts were identified in roughly 4 rows. A large portion of the northern boundary of the cemetery was not able to be excavated due to a high-pressure gas line that runs through the area. The gas line that runs the area was installed in the 1960s, and we believe it may be shallow enough to not have hit any graves. If gas line repair work or replacement is needed in the future, The Section 106 process, or Ohio's state level review, called Ohio Revised Code 149.53, can be initiated to help identify and document any additional burials in this area. After all grave shafts were exposed and documented, metal rods were placed on top of each grave shaft, so individual graves could easily be identified in the future without ground disturbance. The plow zone soil was then replaced. So now that we knew exactly where the cemetery was located, we could confirm the planned development would not adversely affect the cemetery, as the area of disturbance for the hospital and roadway project were further west. There was areas to the south of the cemetery that were slated for future development, so the concern remained about long-term protections to the cemetery. So through the Section 106 process, a protection buffer was set up around the cemetery so any planned future development would not creep too close to the cemetery. The Brown Harris Cemetery was recommended eligible for listing under Criteria D of the National Register for its archaeological significance. And though it was determined the project would not adversely affect the cemetery, the project did not end there. The Army Corps of Engineers agreed to include the following stipulations in their permit to help protect, preserve, and memorialize the cemetery. These stipulations included consultation with interested parties and descendant communities, as well as erecting fencing and a memorial monument. Descendants of both the Brown and Harris families were identified and asked to join the project as consulting parties. Pictured here is Lorraine Harris Jones, showing us pictures of the Harris family ancestors. Other consulting parties included the Dublin Historical Society, Heritage Ohio, and Preservation Ohio. As a group with a focus on input from the Brown and Harris families, the memorialization of the cemetery came to fruition. All aspects of the cemetery were discussed, from the fencing style to the memorial gravestone design to the monogram initial design. The footstone found during the GPR investigation was replicated using 3D imagery and added to the memorial stone. The original footstone fragment is on display at a local elementary school in Dublin that is named after another notable African-American member of the Dublin community. Plaques and signage were installed to educate the public on how the cemetery was discovered and the importance of the African-American families who once lived in this area. In an effort to protect the cemetery long after we're all gone, large boulders were placed along the area of the high-pressure gas line. On those boulders is information of the burials that may lie beneath them and instructions on what should be done before the gas line is ever repaired or replaced. This will help ensure even those who identified and documented the cemetery are no longer around and the institutional memory is lost. These boulders will remind the gas line that burials still likely exist outside of the known boundaries of the cemetery. A beautiful dedication ceremony was held at the Brown Harris Cemetery almost exactly 1 year ago today, attended by members of the Brown and Harris families, local and state officials and representatives, and many interested parties. The University Boulevard project and the discovery of the Brown Harris Cemetery is truly the highlight of my career. It is a shining example of how the Section 106 process can successfully identify lost cultural resources and work with consulting parties to protect the resources for future generations. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Krista. That was really interesting to see how Section 106 can actually lead to the discovery of historic places. I don't think I'm alone in saying that usually we hear about Section 106 and protecting the things that we already know. So this was a new perspective, and especially with that community aspect as well, the memorialization of the site. I think that's also really unique to see that I didn't know Section 106 could contribute to that. So anyways, thank you again for your presentation. And at this point, we will be moving into the Q&A portion of the webinar. So if you have any questions, please feel free to add them into the Q&A box that you can find at the very bottom of your screen. It looks like we do have a few questions already, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into a few of those. Um, in terms of answering the questions, let's go in the order in which you spoke. So I'll pose the question, Blythe, if you could respond first, Krista, you next, and we'll just go about it that way. So the first question is, what's the point of Section 106 if it doesn't guarantee the preservation of a historic property?
Yeah, a fair question. I would, I guess, call folks' attention to a couple of things. One was in describing the sort of overall what Section 106 does is describing it as a forum for the consideration and the balancing of different uh, needs and values in project planning. And so Section 106 allows that historic property concerns about community input. It gives them an entry point into federal project planning so that those concerns can be brought to the federal agency's attention. So no, it doesn't necessarily mandate that every historic property is preserved, because there have to be ways for the federal agency to work with all the other sort of needs and goals and things that they're called upon to accomplish. But it does allow that important consideration, that taking into account that Section 106 makes possible. So in that sense, it's a great opportunity for community input.
Yeah. And I would just add, I mean, the example I gave of the Brown Harris Cemetery is exactly how well the Section 106 process can preserve a cultural resource. You know, Blythe's right, it doesn't happen every time. Now, I will say, if it was not for the Section 106 process, that cemetery never would have been discovered. The Section 106 process required the identification of cultural resources at the site as part of the 106 process, and allowed us as subject matter experts at the State Historic Preservation Office to be part of that consultation and say, we really think there's a cemetery out here. We need to keep looking for it. And we did. And sometimes that pressure, if you will, as part of the 106 process can allow for the discovery of cultural resources. If it wasn't for Section 106, even if this development wouldn't have identified the cemetery, because if you remember, it was a no adverse effect to the cemetery, future development that was planned to the south of it likely would have found the cemetery, but they would not have found it until they were actively constructing, and likely would have destroyed multiple burials in the process. So, you know, you're right. It doesn't always protect and preserve cultural resources, but it can. And it especially can if there's good consultation and good involvement from consulting parties.
Okay. I think that's actually a good segue into the next question we just received, which asks, how does the federal agency, SHPO, and other consulting parties work with federally recognized tribes in the Section 106 process? And can local Native American groups not federally recognized participate in this process? So elaborating more on those who can consult, who can participate.
Let's see, I guess, do you want me to start again? And I can.
Yeah.
Yes, so both in statute and in the Section 106 regulations, federal agencies are required to consult with federally recognized Indian tribes, as well as Native Hawaiian organizations that may have interests in properties that could be affected in a Section 106 review. And so federal agencies, of course, consult with federally recognized Indian tribes, both in the context of Section 106, but also in their broader, meeting their broader responsibilities for government to government consultation based on their responsibilities representing the federal government. So that process is certainly something that every agency should be looking at as they go through any Section 106 review, is what tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations may be interested. There are non-federally recognized Indian tribes who can participate as other consulting parties. And so I think as we looked at that consultation table I noted that other parties may request to be involved. And so certainly a non-federally recognized Indian tribe could express its interest in the historic preservation effects of a project and request to consult with the federal agency that way.
Yeah, and I'll just add as a employee of SHPO and previous 106 reviewer, in Ohio, we're one of, I don't know how many states in the nation that don't have any tribal partners living here in Ohio anymore. So there is no tribal lands. We have no TIPOs in Ohio, which just makes it difficult because they're not sort of in our backyard, if you will. So sometimes we as an agency can work just simply sometimes reminding federal agencies that there is tribes that still have interest in Ohio lands. We have many, many tribal partners here in Ohio. It's just most of the tribal lands that they now live on are mostly out in Oklahoma and out west. So sometimes for us, it's just helping remind agencies that even though there are no tribal lands maybe directly involved in a project, that we definitely have tribal partners that would be or could be interested in projects. So sometimes we can just help make sure all the check boxes are checked and that the federal agency is doing their best to consult with them as well.
Okay. And then moving away from consulting, let's talk about actually initiating the Section 106 process. Whose responsibility is it to initiate Section 106? Does it come from the federal involvement side, from a project lead? Is there someone responsible, or can anyone initiate the process?
Yes, the federal agency is ultimately responsible for compliance with Section 106. Now, that said, federal agencies can, in certain limited informal ways, delegate some responsibilities, for instance, to applicants. And so just as an example of that, you might see in your state that the Department of Transportation works under the terms of what's called a programmatic agreement, where the State Department of Transportation takes on certain Section 106 responsibilities that would otherwise be with the Federal Highway Administration because they use the federal funds designated for the highway system in that state. So it might be the DOT there who starts to do some of the things the federal agency would, but that can happen only when there is sort of a formal agreement about how the agency is delegating that responsibility. Ultimately, the federal agency is the decision maker and has to lead the review.
Okay. But can another community, for example, Krista, in your case, no one knew about that site previously. It was discovered through Section 106. In a case similar to that, maybe not at that particular cemetery, could a community who has information maybe passed down orally through generations, could they be the ones to initiate the process, or would they only be able to let the federal agency involved know, and it would be initiated that way?
So I will say, the practical, or let's say the written 106 process versus sometimes what happens in real life isn't always, how things work out. So in Ohio, we do a lot of consultation with project leads, with consultants, people who really are, formally or informally given the responsibility of 106 coordination. It's not always how we prefer to work. And if projects have, for example, an adverse effect or a conditional no adverse effect, or will require some kind of agreement, there's no choice but to have the federal agency involved. They have to be signatories on that. They have to be part of the process. But I will say, at least in Ohio, we do a lot of consultation with other people who aren't federal agencies. And, we, at least for now, have the capacity to manage that, but I know some states simply don't. So they will do 106, I say, by the books, where, they talk to federal agencies and they only talk to federal agencies. But we do the best we can to make sure we can be involved in as many projects that may or may not have Section 106 triggers. So sometimes we do consult on projects where they don't know, they're like, this might go 106 or it might not. We're always happy to provide advice and guidance on the protection of cultural resources, you know, even if it maybe down the road doesn't trigger 106. So however we can help, and I know a lot of SHPOs are in the same situation, however we can help protect and preserve cultural resources, we'll try our best.
Okay. And since the goal of the Section 106 process is to prevent adverse effects on historic properties, for example, Blythe, you talked about the mitigation strategies in the project involving Taos. Is there actually an entity responsible for ensuring compliance with mitigation measures? Or do you just have to hope that you provide the mitigation strategies, you work with people to develop them, and that they actually do come to fruition? If they don't, is there something that can be done?
Sure. So how that works is that if there's going to be mitigation, if there are adverse effects and we need measures to resolve them, then that's put into a Section 106 agreement document. Section 106 agreements, either called memoranda of agreement or programmatic agreements, are legally binding. And the federal agency that is leading that Section 106 review is responsible for ensuring that it meets the terms of the agreement that it signs on to. So ultimately, the federal agency is there to commit and to ensure that those measures are carried out. Now, other parties, you know, it could be a local or state agency, it could be a nonprofit, it could be other people may take on responsibilities and kind of, you know, be assigned jobs under that MOA. But again, the federal agency would be providing oversight for it. And the way that we have to ensure, you know, agencies carry those things out is that then the other signatories that might include, or often usually the State Historic Preservation Office, it might include the ACHP in some cases, then, you know, or other consulting parties to that project can then raise questions to the federal agency about how are you doing on that mitigation? Have we completed the things that, you know, are on schedule to be done by this point or whatever? And so the other parties to the agreement kind of act as that, I guess, the I don't know what the right analogy would be right now, but kind of as a backstop to make sure that the mitigation is being carried out.
Yeah, and I'll just add that when if we feel in the SHPO that the 106 process is maybe stalled out or we can't come to an agreement, that's a lot of times when we definitely try to involve the ACHP because they can help us with those processes if the 106 process isn't going isn't moving along the way it should.
So, Blythe, it sounds like you are the enforcement of Section 106 mitigation strategies.
Those questions can come to the advisory council, and then that's where we can work with the federal agency, with the other parties who are involved to try to figure out what's going on. You know, is it a question where the agreement needs to be modified because something that the parties thought was possible when they first did it, it no longer is, you know, so there's different ways to work through that. So that's part of ACHP's sort of advisory role.
Okay. Wow, it sounds like there's a lot of different ways you can go about mitigating, going back to the table, revising. I imagine it's a long process. Another question we have, this is interesting. This person asks, what is the criteria that defines a historic property? And it looks like they bring it up because there's a big difference between ensuring the protection of something recognized like Taos, it's a World Heritage Site, versus what seems to be, Krista, in your case, a private family cemetery.
Well, I'll just give the sort of straightforward answer and then turn it to Krista because I think she could probably draw better distinctions here from her experience. But of course, ultimately, it's the National Register criteria, and there's lots of National Register guidance on what meets the criteria for different types of properties and those kinds of things. So that's where that aspect of the National Register, you know, also created by the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 106 mesh together. But I'm sure Krista probably has a better way to share that distinction with her example.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is about eligibility. Now, when it comes to cemeteries, I like to say they're their own beast when it comes to cultural resources because they do contain by default human remains. And that mostly, you know, outside of the NAGPRA, so Act, if it happens to be prehistoric or American Indian remains, that can kind of really involve a lot more state law and state protection at that point. So, of course, some states would and may have protections on the book for properties, historic homes and things like that. But most states do have something in writing that helps protect human remains. So cemeteries a little bit are, I say they're their own beast. They're a different situation because when it comes to the effects of a project in the 106 process to a cemetery, it's not just is it listed on the National Register or not? Because just because it's not, and cemeteries do have to meet criteria consideration D to be eligible for the National Register, which essentially says they have to be exceptional. Then a lot of cemeteries aren't eligible for the National Register, but that doesn't mean that a developer just gets to come in and plow through the cemetery and destroy the human remains there. So they are different. It's a different situation.
And then related, this person asks, what happens when efforts to identify historic properties on behalf of the federal agency on undertakings are deficient? Does the SHPO or ACHP get involved to see that appropriate identification efforts are made?
And I guess I know we're probably coming close to time, so the quick answer, I guess, is so the regulations call on the federal agency to make a reasonable and good faith identification effort. And in doing that, in deciding what kind of an identification effort is appropriate, the federal agency works that out in consultation. They should be having a conversation with the SHPO, with other consulting parties, with Indian tribes who may be involved, to figure out what are the appropriate identification efforts in this circumstance, and then following up on that. So I'll just also mention that if there are disputes at the end of that step about whether the agency, properly made a finding of no historic properties affected, there's a referral process to the ACHP.
Yeah, and I think, at least again, I'll speak for Ohio. We oftentimes just serve as the subject matter experts for the identification process. So the state, we have our own manual on how, proper archaeological investigations should take place in Ohio, for example. We can and do question investigation methodology if we don't believe it was sufficient. But really, like it does kind of come down to a lot of the federal agencies that coordinate with us, and the individual reviewers in those federal agencies a lot of times aren't cultural resource experts. So for example, when we work with like the Army Corps, most of those people are trained biologists and ecologists. So they simply sort of rely on us to give our opinion on whether proper identification has been done as part of the 106 process, because it's not their area of expertise. So I feel like in a way, SHPO is sort of the first line of that. We're the ones that are really working with federal agencies, again, who may not have professionals around cultural resources that are working on projects to say, hey, here's what we think. And then, like Blythe said, other consulting parties and TIPOs and things can definitely provide their input on if identification was sufficient or not.
Okay, perfect. Well, we are at about time. We've gone through all the Q&A questions, but I do have one for both of you. You've kind of hinted at it throughout your discussions and responses, but my question would be more so along the lines of, we've mentioned that in Section 106, historians can be involved, archaeologists, you even mentioned biologists. So more so when we're looking at emerging professionals who are going into historic preservation careers, what kind of experience do they need to work on Section 106 from this side of things? Maybe you two can even share some details about your career paths, how they've changed over time, how you came to Section 106. If you have the time to do that, I think that would be a good, interesting note to end on.
Sure. And there's so many different pathways to Section 106 review. And I think if you talked to a room full of folks who work with Section 106, you'd probably get a whole different set of answers for each person. I think what those who are looking to go into the field can do to really, help themselves is find ways to get some hands-on experience. through internships or, field schools or whatever you can do to learn some of the tasks, some of the job responsibilities that are involved in this, or even more wonderfully, get some exposure where you can be a part of 106 reviews or developing the information that's going to support them. Whether that's from the identification kind of side of things, maybe with historic structures, learning to, assess buildings in the field with survey, make decisions about whether it might be National Register eligible, writing, National Register nominations to get a feel for how that justification is made. Same thing, I would assume with archaeology. There's a lot of different ways to get involved. I came at this as a historian and started from that pathway, in researching and documenting historic properties. And that was where, in a state historic preservation office, I first worked directly with Section 106 review and looking at the documentation that came in from federal agencies, and then playing that part along with the other SHPO staff of, figuring out, do we agree that the federal agency has made, a determination of eligibility for this place, and we agree. So that was kind of my pathway in, and then it morphed into more planning as my career proceeded. So Krista, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah. So here in the Ohio SHPO, we really divide up staff in two ways. Either you're a below ground archaeologist or you're an above ground architectural historian. So I'm a little unusual because my undergraduate work was in archaeology, but my graduate work was in public history. So I actually wanted to be a museum professional. That was my goal. But lucky me, graduating during a recession, there was no museum work to be had. So I got back into archaeology, doing archaeology work as a cultural resource professional, and got hired on for a private consulting firm. So even though I tried to traject myself away from archaeology, I got sucked back in. But ultimately, I'm a historian as well. So, but I will say that, most of the expertise around doing 106 work is either from an architectural side or from an archaeological side. So I will say, being sort of what I call a generic historian might not cut it either way. Being an archaeologist really does usually require a master's degree if you're going to work in a SHPO or work as a principal investigator. So sometimes that's not always told and clear to professionals going in the field, but getting a master's is, and I would argue, almost required these days. And then doing field school. I have met archaeologists who graduated with undergraduate degrees and have never stepped foot in the field. Archaeology is a hands-on career. Doing your time in the field is absolutely necessary to understand the proper identification of archaeological resources. So definitely do a field school, preferably in America, even though the international ones are exciting. Most of the work you're going to find is here in America. And then at least looking into getting a master's degree. So that would be my recommendation.
Some helpful advice. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And thank you for your time today to break down Section 106, what it is, who's involved, how it works, what it looks like, the consequences that can arise from it, such as discovering a site and memorializing it, or just making sure that we continue to preserve our World Heritage sites and other historically significant sites throughout the country. So once again, it was a pleasure to have you both on today. We really appreciate it. And for those of you in the audience, we will be having future episodes of the Bridging the Gap series, so stay tuned to find out what our next topic is. In the future, we will also be putting recommended resources for additional study on our website. Blythe also mentioned the training courses that ACHP puts on. We'll be sure to include a link for those as well. They take place virtually, I believe, Blythe, but also in person. So hopefully if there are those of you in the audience that are really interested in learning more about Section 106, you could take advantage of those. But we'll close out here. So thank you again, Blythe and Krista, and everyone in the audience. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you for the next episode. Bye-bye.
Thank you.